Good morning, everybody. We have a very interesting panel ahead of us. We've already had some indications of where the attention should be going from this initial poll. I did note that it was for this year, the remainder of this year, where the attention should be focused. But I think in our panel, we'll try and explore a little bit where the priorities and policy orientations for the next legislative period should be going. Just by way of introduction, I think the Juncker Commission was all about jobs and growth. I think we can say it was largely successful. All countries are back to modest growth, and unemployment is down in most, if not all, member states, perhaps not to a level that we would like, but it is down and improving. Having said that, there is still plenty of unfinished business in the financial services area. Of course, banking union, capital markets union come to mind. And there are also a number of setbacks in the broader sense, with a member state for a first time deciding to leave the European Union and the Brexit. But within the member states that are still inside the EU, there is also growing populism and in some countries growing Euroscepticism. So we need a Commission that needs to take all member states. We also have, beginning of this month, a commission that deemed it necessary to take all member states to court for failing to implement correctly the Services Directive that had been taken a decision on 10 years earlier. So in this panel, we would like to discuss the political mood in the EU and what lays ahead of us. In the panel, we have assembled an MEP, a Commission representative, and a major investor. So if I can start the questions, and I will focus on the European Parliament, because at least there, from all the institutions, we have a clear result that we can work with. Some of the other institutions are still speculative. But Mr. Ferber, if I can ask you an assessment of the outcome of the European parliamentary elections and how you see that, what that means for future lawmaking. Naturally, I need to congratulate you with your re-election. We're very pleased to see you back.
Thank you.
But how do you think the Parliament will operate going forward when it always needs to build coalitions between different parties, as opposed to the previous parliament where you had two main parties that could constitute a majority?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the congratulations, and I'm very happy as well. But honestly, if you look to the outcome, there are a few lessons to be learned. Number one, it's the first time we are replacing 3 out of 4 MEPs roundabout in average. We never had such a tremendous change. So we have a huge majority of newcomers and only a small minority of re-elected members. So that is the challenge number one, because every system, even the European Parliament, to describe it as a system, has its own rulings, its own behaviors, and to bring more than 70% new elected members in such a system is a huge challenge. And you saw it on the second issue I want to mention. There have been a lot of parties all over Europe who tried to change everything what happened in the past. We saw it from the Salvini side, starting with that, who wanted to have on the right side a large group, minimum number 2 or number 3. They failed to deliver that. On the other hand, we had En Marche, to be very open-minded as well, and Monsieur Macron tried to overcome the old system as well, and he failed as well. So the European party system has been shown more stable than some party systems in member states, and that is the second lesson to learn. It's not time for revolutions in Europe. But the third lesson, I started 25 years ago in the European Parliament, where the two largest groups had 80% of MEPs. Now we don't have even 50%, not even 40. And that is the next challenge, to create majorities in the European Parliament will become more difficult, as you need minimum 3, better 4 groups together, because no group, if you look to the past, is able to deliver 100% of its votes on every issue. So there are always some people missing, that's the one point, but the other point is that there are always some parties, because of national, regional interests, not following group lines, so you have to organize a larger majority than really needed. On the other hand, if you look to the big points in the last years, the Parliament was able to deliver 80–90% support, especially on financial market regulation, for example. We had an overwhelming majority which strengthened us in comparison to the Council, as really the Parliament was a fighter, a common fighter on its interest, and therefore I'm not so pessimistic, but it will take more time, more need for discussions to come to this kind of solutions. And then of course we have a disturbing factor, sorry to say it as clear as I do, as United Kingdom was allowed to join the elections, because they brought the outcome of the UK result brought some things which will not be the case without Brexit. If I start with the Green Group, 50% of the growth of the Green Group comes from United Kingdom. The growth of the Liberal Group, or Renew Europe is the new name of this group, comes from the Lib Dems. And the government party, the Tories, are not even visible anymore. They are the big losers, and even Labour was not able to win, which is in a two-party system very surprisingly, but the largest group comes from this new-built Brexit party. But according to the latest outcome yesterday in the Tory group in London, we think that the former Foreign Affairs Minister will become the next party leader and Prime Minister, so we think 31st of October will be the Brexit date. It's my estimation, but it's the most probable one. I would bet on that, and I come from a region where we bet on nothing. So I would bet on that. Not speaking about the details, but for the all the steps which have to be done now, the Brits are decisive, and that is something you have to take into account, because the Parliament later will be a fully different one than you have for the moment. And I try to describe the most outcomes. The EPP will be stronger, because if the places are refilled according to the agreement with the Council, we get more than the others, and the others will lose. Even Socialists and Democrats, and of course the Liberals and the Greens. And then we have a new shufflement of the whole construction, which is again strengthening the, maybe to call it like that, the old structure of the European Parliament. So taking that into account, I feel not as uncomfortable as it looked in the 26th evening when the first results from member states came in.
Thank you. I want to come to sort of now the policy areas that will be most likely coming forward. I'll come back to you, Mr. Ferber, but perhaps if I can turn to the Commission, taking a backward look on what the Juncker Commission has achieved. What are the ambitions going forward into the new legislative period? Will it be an ambitious Commission, or do you want to see an ambitious Commission? Or is it one that will consolidate and try to work with a Parliament that may be more difficult to achieve agreement with than up to this point? And by the way, any inside information on who the new Commission President might be?
Thank you so much, Robert, especially for the last question. And of course, kudos for convening your summit literally hours before the leaders meet, not far from here, to decide, among other things, about the nominees. All I can say about that is that, I mean, there is a short list of candidates. We all know who they are. To be honest, each one of them has great qualities, and this is deeply reassuring about the forthcoming period in Europe, because whoever it is that takes over will be in charge of a similarly ambitious agenda, even though there will be obviously some differences in emphasis, but nothing more than that. Maybe one word about the EP elections. I find the results very heartening in the sense that the participation increased sizably. So the Europeans definitely feel that they have a stake in this process. They also, I mean, many people said that this was maybe the first genuinely pan-European debate, and I think there is a lot of truth to it. These elections are usually basically national elections which are coordinated, harmonized, and they take place at the same time. But this time we did have something different. We did have a pan-European debate about the most important issues. And I would say that there are three which come to my mind with respect to the next 5 years. Firstly, it's technology and industrial policy, because I think Europe has realized that it needs to become much more strategic in these areas. This is where value creation takes place, and we have great potential, we have great fundamental research. The whole world is envious of the European Research Council and the way it spends money, but it is not always translated into genuine innovations in the real economy. So that's an area where we need to have much greater focus. Human-centric technology is a term which has made inroads in this debate, because we don't want to, in a way, reconstitute something which exists in the United States with more monopolistic emphasis in the digital area with big players. We also obviously don't want to recreate something that China has built, a more surveillance-based digital capitalism. We want to go our own way, and this is a human-centric way with emphasis on a high level of protection of privacy. With high moral standards. And obviously what has to be ensured is that there is value creation on that basis, because high moral standards are great per se, but one needs to build value on top of it. So that's clearly one area. The second area has to do with sustainability and climate policy. I mean, it came very high on your list. And of course, the bad news is that, I mean, if you look at the latest report of the International Energy Agency, it's clear that we have record emissions basically week on week. And whenever you look, there are record emissions, and investment in renewables has stalled. Has stalled for the first time since 2000, in spite of falling prices. So there is clearly a need for an additional incentive in this area. And Europe has this ambition of going carbon neutral by 2050. And there will be real steps taken by the next Commission on how to achieve that. And the final area I wanted to mention has to do with renewing the social contract, because it's clear that we live in a period of social and societal disruption, that many people feel the effects of change. And we need to help them along the way in that transition. And for me, that means in particular emphasis on skills, because skills is what will make a difference in this new economy. Maybe finally, just a comment on trade, because it came top of your list. And to our surprise, perhaps, this has been a commission dominated by the trade agenda on both sides of the equation, both positive and negative, if you may. We started having an ambitious project with the United States, TTIP, that's sort of on hold, for the moment at least. But we have concluded the biggest deal ever with Japan, and we have seen the agreement with Canada, which is important because it's an agreement of a new qualitative nature. TTIP was also meant to be like that. It's a new generation trade agreement which enters into this area of regulatory convergence. And I think its achievements are already spectacular, and it is the direction of travel for the future, even though that future may not be imminent. So trade, I think, will obviously stay on the agenda for the next Commission.
Okay. Elga, turning to you as an investor, a large investor, are you hearing the right kind of noises in terms of what Europe will be able to deliver, the policies that are being focused on, or are there elements that are being overlooked that you would find more important or important to bring into the mix?
Yes, thank you very much. So let me first of all, though, sort of say something as a European citizen. I think we can be very proud of what we are trying to achieve here. And actually, I think could well be creating a third way between what we are seeing playing out between the US and China at the moment. And I think for Europe it is essential to become more independent in a number of key areas, like Pavel already alluded to. This technology, Europe is clearly leading on a number of issues globally, whether it is conducting new trade agreements, whether it is pushing on with sustainable issues, but also having a by and large functioning welfare state. And I do think that the great diversity of political views, of social preferences, of economic models, and also is a great asset. And so we should also bear in mind that what we see in terms of the rise in populism or political fragmentation is not unique to Europe, and it's also certainly not unique to the European Parliament. So this is a broader issue, and I think there's potentially a very solid case to make that Europe is uniquely placed to rise to these challenges. But clearly, we have to work on this. And I think for me, one of the key issues is that potential growth, the speed limit for inflation-free growth in Europe is low. And we need to work on that. And I think in this context, a renewed focus on the single market and completing it in the areas where there are still obstacles, I think is very, very important. And this ranges, concerns in particular a range of crucial network industries. It concerns the digital industry, everywhere where you have essentially economies of scale playing an important role. But it also concerns the financial industry. The completion of the banking union and the capital market union was already stressed by Olli Rehn in the first session this morning. I would fully support that. And I think it's important to stress that the relevance of this goes well beyond the financial industry, because the financial industry is here to ensure an efficient allocation of capital. And that is absolutely essential to be able to fund the right kind of investments into our future, and also to cut off things, projects, investments, business ideas that don't look sustainable anymore. And particularly the capital market union has also a very important role to play in buffering against asymmetric shocks, which is a great challenge for a monetary union of the size of the one that we created in Europe across a diverse set of countries. Because what you will see is that in other theaters, whether it's the United States, Canada, or even individual member states such as Germany, a very considerable part of the risk sharing, the buffering of shocks within these countries is actually not happening through fiscal transfer mechanism or fiscal reinsurance mechanism. It's actually happening through cross-border investment. And of that, we don't have enough. In fact, during the Euro crisis, we saw, particularly banks, for good reasons, sort of renationalizing their activities and being somewhat hesitant with cross-border activities. And we also still have a massive tilt towards debt instruments and bank loans rather than equity investments. And I think that brings me back to the late 1990s, when we had the new economy taking off. First in the US and in Europe, we wondered sort of whether we would be able to replicate something like that. And I think there is an important lesson coming from this, because Europe didn't lack the business ideas, but what it lacked is the ability of its companies to grow as quickly as their US counterparts, and thus becoming relevant players globally. And this has both its roots in the access to financing, but also its roots in a lot of regulation being applied to companies that grow beyond a certain size. And I do think that we need to look at that. So refocus on the single market. It is by far our biggest asset. And I think in particular, if you look what's happening in the rest of the world, it's even becoming even more important than it was.
I think many of the ideas that have been launched here, from a rational point of view, everybody could agree to them and support them. Having said that, there is a mistrust or reticence across member states, inside the member states, to move forward with these projects, whether it's the new multi-annual financial framework, whether it's a degree of mutualization, solidarity inside the banking union. Is there a magic ingredient, so to say, that we can apply for this to be unlocked? Is there, and this is partly a question from the audience, is there room for, and how to promote that, how to achieve that some of the surplus countries invest more and trigger some of the investment cycles across member states, that savings in one part can be used in other parts of the EU where it's called for? Mr. Ferber, perhaps European Parliament perspective is, what's the magic ingredient?
I think we should take up what Pavel said rightly, the momentum we got from the electorate. Because my understanding was really the electorate is already more European than the capitals in the European Union are, and the governments in the member states are. And I think if Parliament really delivers something out of the result of the elections, it's really a process to start to have really European issue Europeanized. Because what we have for the moment is, and I say it very open-minded, a lot of mistrust in between member states, even in between governments sometimes, but between the member states itself, member states against the European institutions, and of course, inside the European institutions as well. And we have organized a way of check and balances which makes it so complicated to deliver, which makes it so hard to deliver. But honestly, the world is not waiting for us. So the challenges which have been brought up in the electoral campaign and which was supported by the electorate to Europeanize a lot of political issues, even on the economic side, should be delivered now. And I think the only driving force for that can be Commission together with a strong European Parliament on that issue. That's why we are working for some a political frame inside these four pro-European groups to deliver idea how this could be, and I hope we can follow that, because on the other hand you have to see that we are more or less at the end of a business cycle. We have a lot of gray clouds in the sky coming from the United States. We don't know whether in autumn we will have further problems on the tariff systems between the European Union and the United States as we are coming closer to the electoral campaign in the United States. Yeah, Mr. Trump wants to deliver to his electorate, not to us. So we have to be aware of that. We are still in a zero-rate interest rate environment, and looking what has been discussed in Sintra, a lot of promises has been done to strengthen engagement of the European Central Bank, and that will create another environment we have to be into account. And of course, we have the white elephant in the room, Brexit, and no one knows if it will be a hard Brexit, which was the former idea of Mr. Johnson. We don't know whether he's following that for the moment as well. Will have an economical impact as well to the whole European Union. We have the not yet solved problem of the financial frame after 2020. And honestly, if I look to the new elected European parliaments, the Greens never supported a trading agreement. So the possibility to organize a majority for new agreements, as we are trying to finalize Mercosur, for example, which would be very important, with some problems, not to discuss it, agriculture, only to mention the headline. But there you need a majority in the parliament as well. And if you look to the last agreement, Singapore was the last we voted on. The new elected parliament in its composition, it's more difficult to organize majorities for those agreements, though there are a lot of dark clouds already visible on the sky. Maybe some others will come, maybe some sunshine will come through as well. But we have to take that into account as well, the environment we are working on. And therefore, we really need a strong momentum to Europeanize European issues. And sorry to throw it out of the hands of the member states who keep it as their main heritage and not creating this European environment. As I said very clearly, the world is not waiting till 28 member states are able to decide unanimously on more or less ridiculous issues. The world is waiting that Europe takes in some areas the lead. To give a positive example, in trade policy, rule-based trade policy, in climate change policy, fulfilling the Paris agreements, and to show the world that economic growth and sustainability and fight against climate change is possible and is not making people poor, to translate it in a very clear way. Only to mention a few things we have to deliver, and I hope therefore the European Parliament will be the driving force. And that means as well we have to think, after the Lisbon Treaty is now 10 years old in November, it's 10 years into force, to think where to re-establish some areas in the Lisbon Treaty to make it more a European treaty than a watchdog for national interests.
Pavel, maybe from the Commission point of view, the sort of multi-annual financial framework, I have one or two questions linked to that. Sort of the social contract you mentioned. How can you develop that a little bit, and especially in relation with immigration?
Yes.
And then a side question around whether the European budget could be used to promote something like financial inclusion in member states, that funding would flow from the EU to bring about level playing field in different member states where this...
Yes. Right, so I think there are two ways of going about pushing the European agenda forward, which is what you asked earlier. One possibility would be to have a big contractual arrangement, a big package, by means of which member states agree on a range of initiatives at the same time. That's nice intellectually, but to my view, it will never work in practice. It's a union of 28, soon to be 27 members with a complex range of interests. So an alternative to that is to simply move forward wherever there is an opportunity. And I think this is what has been happening in the past years, and this is our best chance for the future as well. An example of an area where a lot has happened in the past 2 to 3 years is defense. An issue which has been totally out of the radar in Europe for 60 years before. Then all of a sudden, it's now a growth industry, and we are proposing the creation of European defense funds with over 13 billion euro, which will invest in research and development, and which will be the biggest spender for research and development in Europe as an entity. Single market is indeed our biggest asset, and in many areas we have a greater competitive advantage to the United States. I'm thinking of financial passporting. If you are a fintech that wants to have activities across the European Union, and if you apply for a banking license, well, on that basis, you can sell directly across the EU, which is not something you would be able to do in the United States, where you would need to go from state to state and ask for separate licenses. A lot of regulation is supporting innovation. It doesn't always do that, but we obviously need to ensure that it does. So the Payment Services Directive, for example, has done a lot to open up the financial services that are now changing literally from day to day. Invest in tech or die seems to be the slogan in the financial services industries, and some of banks present in Europe have higher R&D budgets than tech firms, and this is being supported by the regulatory regime. So rather than try to construct this ideal scenario in which everyone agrees on everything, I think a much better way is to move forward where there is scope. You ask about the multi-annual financial framework, which is our obviously big budgetary instrument, and it's still waiting for agreement, even though a lot of preparatory work has been done in this term. Well, the big issue there is to balance what are so-called new priorities, and they have to do with immigration, with border control. They have to do with climate policies, they have to do with technology, with the more traditional EU policies, spending on common agricultural policy and cohesion. Cohesion goes towards your second question about the territorial aspects of how we develop. And of course, there the challenge is that the current technological developments support what is called an agglomeration effect, namely talent attracts talent, and investments are clogged in places. But by definition, then the other places seemingly lose out. And cohesion policy is that instrument of ensuring that everyone has an equal chance. And it's based on an idea called smart specialization, which has been working fairly well. And smart specialization is about identifying assets of an individual region and investing in building on those assets. So rather than everyone in Europe doing nanotechnology, it is about looking at what actually exists, what potential exists in each region, and investing respectively so as best to reflect the potential that really exists. So the multi-annual financial framework will be one of the first tasks for the new cycle. I'm fairly optimistic that we're not far from an agreement. But there are ritual discussions at the political level on budgetary questions. So I would not exclude that this takes a bit longer, but our ambition would be to have an agreement by the end of the year. And this would also obviously send a very strong signal about Europe moving forward.
Okay. Elga, again, looking at all this from an investor point of view, Europe definitely full of promise, but is it somewhere where you say this is where the bulk of investment should be going, or is the growth in other parts of the world more important, and how is that balance, and if it's in the wrong direction, have what you've heard about future policies, is that the right approach?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the somewhat lower potential output growth rate, which is sort of something that matters to long-term investors. And there is a little bit that we can do about it, but things such as demographics or the fact that this is already a high-income region and thus struggles a little bit more to grow than emerging markets that are catching up, that is a fact of life. I would say that at the current juncture, there are two things that concern investors with respect to Europe. One is European fragmentation, which ranges from Brexit to noises out of Italy as to whether the whole arrangements make sense from the point of view of some voices in the country. So you can clearly show that that is systematically weighing on European equity markets broadly, not just on the local markets. So fragmentation is one important factor. And the other one, I think, is concerns about us being in the late stage of this upswing and investors not having complete clarity of how Europe is going to weather the next downturn. The concerns are twofold. One is, does the European Central Bank have enough ammunition? Does it have the same ammunition as the Federal Reserve? I do think that that is also why there's a lot of focus on who is going to be the next ECB president at the moment. But I would also say that one shouldn't underestimate the willingness and ability of the ECB to deliver innovative policy instruments that prove highly effective, even though they often initially get criticized because they look different than what has been done in other theaters. And the second concern around the next downturn is obviously a rerun of the euro crisis. Mm-hmm. And so these are sort of, I think, real life issues that investors are grappling with. And the more clarity we can try to provide around this and to make sure, again, that investors don't underestimate the political will in Europe. And actually the commitment of the populations to the euro. We have seen a number of Eurosceptic parties in large euro area countries dropping the idea of challenging the euro membership.
Okay, well, we're into the last minute of the panel, so I just wanted to pick up two questions that came through, and they were directed at Mr. Ferber, related to Brexit. We have a panel later today on the question of Brexit, but the questions I picked up from, or came through from the audience is, what kind of effect do you expect Brexit to have on the Parliament? A reshuffling of the committees once the UK has left, and there is also an open question, will all the UK MEPs withdraw, or can they stay?
Of course not. To answer the second question very clearly, who is member of the European Union has the right to send members, who is not to the Parliament, who is not member of the European Union, has no right to send members to the European Parliament, though they are elected as long as UK stays in the European Union. And that's very clear. I heard that some lawyers try to identify as the Parliament is elected for 5 years, so they have a 5-year term, whatever happens. No, if you are not member of the Union, you can't send members to the Parliament. So therefore it's very clear. We will get a reshufflement because it was agreed that the Parliament will then try to sort out the problems that some member states are underrepresented historically, as Spain, for example, asked in the Nice Treaty for more votes in the Council, so they got less members in the Parliament, though to have the mathematical order again. That will be resolved, so we will then be 705 members after that, and of course we will reshuffle the members of the committee, but not the chair structure. That's very clear as well. That will be done now, and that is for 2.5 years. But honestly, I have not yet heard from any group a Brit getting one of these posts. Because it's very clear, if you have a Brit over there, this person have to be replaced, so no one is taking them on board for the moment for these posts to be filled in the next week. If you ask me who will become chair of Econ, I don't know. Mr. de Hond is decisive on that, and Mr. de Hond is delivering for the moment tables, and the political groups then have to decide their priorities. I heard some rumors that the existing chair, Mr. Gualtieri, wants to stay on this post, but that will be decided by Mr. Dond and not by me and not by Mr. Gualtieri, and to keep the last secret. the Econ committee is not as attractive as it was in the past. So for the moment, the groups have decided to shrink it down to 60 members, from 65 to 60. And even there, some groups have problems to fill all the seats. So the priority of MEPs is similar to your question in the beginning: trade, climate change, which means environment committee, and industry committee, as the energy is located there, which has climate aspects as well. Econ has lost its momentum, and everyone sees there's a lot of technical work, so the interest is slowing down. But I have already decided to stay there, and as everyone who asked for Econ gets it for the moment, you can be assured I will be in Econ again.
Okay. Thank you very much for these latest little insights in the Parliament going forward. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their views and for their direction going forward. And we look forward working with all of you in the next parliamentary legislative term. Thank you very much.